Likutei Sichos, Chelek Chavtes, Volume 29, the Sicha for Parshas Vayelech. This Sicha will be a clarification and a deeper explanation into the words that Moshe said on the day of his passing, namely that today my days are filled, Lo uchal lotzeis v'lovoi, I can no longer go and come. What that means, and a lesson from this for each and every one of us. As a quick introduction, it's known, obviously, that the entire Torah, that is the 5 books of the Torah, were written exclusively by Moshe Rabbeinu, by Moses, as dictated to him by Hashem. There is a discussion, perhaps even a debate, as to the last 8 verses of the Torah, which state that Moshe had passed away and speaks of him already in past tense, who he was and his greatness. There is a debate as to who exactly wrote the Torah. But the prevailing opinion is that even those verses were written by Moshe because Moshe could not have handed an incomplete Torah to the people before his passing. And it says he handed every tribe a Torah, a complete Torah. But in any case, what is certain is that at least the rest of the Torah, meaning minus those 8 verses, was certainly written by Moshe. Another thing to be familiar with is one of the Klolei Rashi, the rules in Rashi, that Rashi's explanations of the Torah are obviously not his own inventions, but rather they're all sourced from the words of our sages, whether it's from the Gemara, from the Medrash, and likewise. Typically, Rashi does not find it important, doesn't find it necessary to quote verbatim, to specifically quote from, his actual source, the same words of the actual source. Typically, the way Rashi will choose to quote it is in a manner which stays true to the source, but best brings out the pshutoi shel mikra, the basic understanding of the verse. So whichever Rashi finds more beneficial to express and to bring out the pshutoi shel mikra, that's the type of expression that Rashi will use. But when there isn't any reason to deviate, Rashi will typically stay true to his source. One more last thing, there's something that the Rebbe always referred to as a klotz kasha, which means a question that even a simpleton can ask, okay? And that is, sometimes the Rebbe would point out that because the question is so simple, is so obvious, no one bothers asking it, no one talks about it. Let's go into the Sicha. So on the verse in chapter 31, verse 2, when Moshe says, today I am exactly 120 years old. I can no longer go and come. So the sages tell us, this is in the Gemara, in Gemara Saita, the Gemara says that this doesn't mean that his energy, in a literal sense, was diminished, that he was weakened, because we do find later that Moshe still had this extraordinary energy and he was able to scale the mountain in just a few small steps, just to climb a whole mountain. So obviously it doesn't mean physically. Says the Gemara, what does this mean? Rather it means lotzeis v'lovei, to go and to come in words of Torah, bedivrei Torah. And says the Gemara, Melamed, this teaches us that this all became the gates of wisdom, the gates of Torah. So the Shari Chachma nistatmu memenu, they became kind of sealed up from him, and he's telling them, that's it, my career as a teacher of Torah is over. Now, this is quoted in Rashi, however, with a change, a deviation of expression. Instead of saying that the Shari Chachma, the gates of wisdom, were closed up for him, Rashi says that what does this mean? That I can no longer go and come, that the mesoros umayonos hachachmas, that the traditions and the springs, the well springs of chachma, of wisdom, were closed up for him. Now, indeed, it's interesting. Where does Rashi have this? In other words, where's Rashi's source? Well, to some extent, we can say there are 2 sources. One quotes the word mesoros and says that the traditions were taken away from him. And the other, notice, the other says Mayonas HaChachma, the well springs of Chachma, the sources of wisdom. Rashi chooses to bring the two together. So he's not quoting one place, he's bringing the two together. And the question is, why? And why would he choose to do this, especially considering that this is not really a typical way, a typical expression of reference to Torah, to words of Torah and so on? Why didn't Rashi just say simply that Moshe could no longer teach them words of Torah, that the words of Torah are closed up for him? Says the Rebbe, the answer is actually so simple that it answers a klotz kasha, which nobody bothers asking, nobody bothers addressing, but really the question is so obvious, it almost screams out loud. And that is, regardless of the source, what it seems that we're saying here is Moshe saying, look, I am done. I can no longer teach Torah. The words of Torah are now sealed for me. But this doesn't make sense, because we are now in Parshas Vayelech. We still have the whole Parsha of Vayelech. We have the Parsha of Hazinu, and we have the Parsha of Zos Bracha. And as I emphasized in the introduction, those were certainly delivered and transcribed by Moshe Rabbeinu. So how is it possible to say that at this juncture right here, in the beginning of Parshas Vayelech, Moshe is saying that I can no longer engage in words of Torah, when he did engage in words of Torah, and they're authentic words of Torah, and they were written by him? So it's obvious that he was able to engage in words of Torah. And that is, okay, maybe with the exception of the last 8 verses, according to the opinion that says it wasn't written by Moshe. And in these 3 parshas, it's not just words of Torah, some narratives, but there are also vital laws, vital halachas. Example, the halacha, the mitzvah of Hakel, of gathering all the Jews together after the sabbatical year, after the Shemitah year. And then the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah, the obligation of each Jew being part of the writing of a Torah scroll. So back to the point, how do we say that Moshe Rabbeinu, he no longer can engage in words of Torah? And this is precisely the answer. This is the reason why Rashi chooses not to quote the Gemara verbatim, not to say that Moshe says, I can no longer engage in words of Torah, because the fact is he did engage in words of Torah. But rather Rashi emphasizes that what Moshe says was now sealed for him, meaning no longer accessible to him, were the Masairos, the traditions, and the Mayones HaChachma, the springs or the well springs of wisdom. That this is not included in these 3 parshiot, Vayelech, Hazinu, and Zos Bracha, and therefore does not negate the fact that those were delivered by Moshe, that Moshe had access to words of Torah, yet there was something that he no longer had access to, and that is what Rashi is addressing, and that is what Moshe is telling the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. So let's examine, what do these things mean? What does it mean, the traditions, and what does it mean when you say Ma'ayones HaChachma, the wellsprings of Chachma? So the Rebbe explains, Masoires means those are things, those are traditions, oral traditions, that are not only not written in the Torah explicitly, but they're not even hinted in the Torah. You see, throughout the Gemara, throughout the Talmud, we find many times that although there are many, many laws and details of laws, particulars of laws, that are considered to be oral, Torah Sheba'al Peh, yet there is a source for it, at least hinted in the Torah here, there, and where else. However, there are certain laws, there are certain ideas that the Gemara itself says these are things that were given over to Moshe exclusively orally, meaning there isn't even a source, even a hint in the Torah. This is what's meant when we say Masoires, traditions. Now, what is meant when Rashi says Ma'ayones HaChachma, the well springs, the source of wisdom? This is Pilpula de Uraisa. This is the Pilpul. Pilpul means a very sharp, deep, and intense analytical review of matters, and bringing in from different places, and sometimes almost like razor thin but bringing out brand new ideas, which actually can lead to actual halacha. But it's not the original. When you look at the actual original material, you don't see it there. But once you start to dig into it deeper and start to cross-reference and things like that, then you come up with new novel ideas. This is why it's referred to as Mayones HaChachma, like a mayan, like a spring. A wellspring starts off very, very subtle, just a small stream of water. But once it continues to flow, it continues to get stronger and larger until it can even end up being a raging river. And that's exactly what it is. So that you take a matter, like I said, and you expound it, and it becomes new ideas, new halachas. So from this we understand that all these three parshiyos that Moshe Rabbeinu said post this statement, indeed have full Torah Shebiksav, full Torah Shebal Peh, with all the actual body of the halacha, but it's lacking the pilpul and it's lacking the masoides, the oral tradition. And now we can understand why Rashi chose to say the Mayones HaChachma. Why didn't he say Mayones HaTorah? Because remember, Torah Moshe did have access to. In fact, he did transmit it, as we said, these three parshiyos. But it's the Chachma, it's the other aspect of it, which is the idea of Pilpul, which brings out a deeper appreciation of what's in the Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu unfortunately had no access to. Now here's the question. Okay, it's true that without Masoides, without the access to the traditions, to new oral traditions, Moshe Rabbeinu can, quote unquote, no longer go and come. He can no longer teach them new things. Only that which Hashem is dictating to him and he's transcribing. But why is it that as a result of the second aspect of the springs, the well springs of Chachma being closed up for him, why did this dictate that he can no longer, why did this, in other words, make it so that he can no longer come and go, that he can no longer lead them in Torah? And the answer is as follows. The very mere fact that there is a change in the status of Moshe, by virtue of the fact that there was some kind of change in his access to Torah, this already was an indication that his ability to, quote, come and go and to innovate in Torah with Klal Yisrael, that this was up. Why so? We know the Chazal tell us, and even Rashi quotes it, in reference to the difference between Moshe and his student Yeshua, his successor, that it says, Pnei Moshe kepnei Chama. The face of Moshe is like the face of the sun, whereas the face of Yeshua is like the face of the moon. Now think about the contrast between the sun and the moon. The sun is consistent. It's always the same. It doesn't get bigger, it doesn't get smaller. It's always the same intensity, the same size. In other words, same quantity, same quality. Whereas the moon has varying changes. It has ups and has downs. You see, Moshe is emes. And that's why we say Moshe emes v'Torah emes. Truth never changes. Truth, the true meaning of truth is that it's always exactly the same. And therefore, since Moshe epitomizes the idea of emes, which is expressed in the idea of Pnei Moshe kepnei Chama, that his face is like the sun, therefore, the moment there was a change means and dictated that he no longer is that same person, and therefore he can no longer lead them in Torah. He can only transmit to them and dictate to them whatever Hashem specifically tells him to do, but outside of that, he is done. And here there's no difference what change there was. The mere fact that there was some change, even if it was in some insignificant aspect, but already it's not Moshe. It's no longer the Moshe, that Moshe emes and Torah emes, and therefore Moshe says, Lo yuchal oid lotzis v'lavoi. What is the lesson for all of us? Of course, by first cautioning ourselves, and as it's brought down halacha, that no one can dare compare themselves to Moshe. However, that being said, still, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, each and every Jew every single Jew that is, regardless of his level and stature, has a spark of Moshe in them. And therefore, this can also apply for us. Perhaps, says the Rebbe, this is the idea of the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. If you look in Pirkei Avos, Perek Gimel, Mishnah Ches, chapter 3, Mishnah 8, it says over there, Kol hashecheach dovar echod mimishnasai mala olav akasu kilu mischayv v'nafshe. Anybody who forgets even just one thing from his studies, the verse considers it as if he himself is guilty for his own loss of life. If you think about it, what does that mean? Really? Somebody forgets just one small item, one detail from what he learned throughout all the years, from what he studied in Torah? For that, he should be at least in idea, in spiritually speaking, deserving of, God forbid, the worst punishment of all? Well, the answer is that by a Yid, the words of Torah have to be engraved, literally part and parcel of the essence of his existence. And therefore, even if a tiny, minute quantity is missing, is somewhat lost, it's as if there is a part of his existence that is missing. That's a form of death, at least a small form of death. And who's guilty of it? He, because obviously he didn't invest enough effort to see to it to make sure that that doesn't happen. And the same is also, says the Rebbe, not only in quantity of matter of how much study of the actual content, but also in the sense of time. If a Yid wastes time that he could have used, he could have dedicated for Torah, obviously not time that he needs to eat or to sleep or to engage in earning a living and things like that. We're talking about time that legitimately, according to halacha, should have been dedicated to Torah and doesn't do so. It's like he's missing some time from his life, because the Torah has to be etched, engraved in the essence of one's existence. And it's not even so much the amount of time, it's the actual idea that there is something missing. Even if it's a split second, that already means that there's some part of your life that's missing. And that's what the Mishnah means, and that's what we're learning from Moshe Rabbeinu. That the moment there is some change, the moment there is something lacking, it's no longer the same. And the truth is, says the Rebbe, in a broader sense, this also applies to all matters of Judaism. That everything in Yiddishkeit, everything in halacha, everything in minhag, everything in the way of a Jew has to be, like I said, etched, engraved in a person's essence of his existence. And therefore, every single detail in Yiddishkeit has to and should and does matter to us.